The first thing I want to do is talk to you about masking fluid. My latest favorite is the Pebo drawing gum, P-E-B-E-O, and I like it because it is super thin and you can get a really nice fine line. And the way that I apply my masking fluid most of the time is I just take the butt end of a brush and I dip that in the masking fluid, and then I just apply it to my paper using the end of that brush. So you can make different shapes by using your brush on the side. And I want you guys to pull your masking fluid out and make some shapes using your masking fluid in that area of the grid. The best thing to do with a watercolor painting is to either save the white of your paper by painting around it or by masking it, or understanding the different techniques for lifting after you've painted. And we're going to be doing some of that lifting as well. I just want to explain that you can use the front end of your brush to apply masking, but there's a couple of things I want you to understand. First of all, you don't want to use an expensive sable brush, or even, any brush that's a really good brush, because the masking fluid will ultimately ruin it. But if you find an inexpensive brush, and there's plenty of them out there, the process, because you might have a very large area of masking that you also want to have a significant amount of detail and control, and you don't really have a lot of control using this back end. So at any rate, the process would be take your inexpensive brush and get an old bar of soap or a little hotel bar of soap and keep it in your watercolor kit. Dampen your brush and run it over the soap a couple of times. Then dip it into your masking and apply it to your paper. And you can keep working like that. Occasionally you're going to want to wash your brush again, run it over the soap, and then into the masking and apply it to your paper, and just continue that until you've got the areas that you want masked. If you have used a regular brush to apply your masking, when you're done, you want to clean it out really well in your water, and then take an old toothbrush, get some of that soap on there, and run that old toothbrush right through those bristles on your brush. But that would be the way to use masking properly. So while our masking is drying, we're going to go up to our wet lift and dry lift. You're going to want to have a rag, an old face cloth that hasn't been dried or washed with any fabric softener. So I'm just painting with water. And I'm trying to let you see where I painted. I'm going to leave that little shape there. I'm going to take my script liner and I'm just going to put a nice little swirly line. And after I've done that, I want to let it sit there for a little bit, trying to let it reignite those pigments somewhat and let the paper absorb a little bit of it. And then I'll come in and blot. I'm just blotting the water off the paper. After I've done that, you can already see where it's starting to lift. I'm going to go to a dry section of my face cloth. I'm going to come back and I'm just going to rub. And the more you rub, the lighter that area will get. It's interesting. I looked at this morning and there wasn't a lot of saturation. Obviously, if I have deeper color, I'm going to have more luck with my lifting. So I've just put a little bit up the top there, and I'm going to try and do it with a paper towel. I'll blot, I'll go to a dry area, and I'll rub. There you go. This gives you a nice soft effect as well. Not as soft as when you do a wet lift, but it's not completely hard-edged. And once you've taken that color off of there, you can come back in and shade it and paint on it. I had said as a watercolorist, we don't paint with the color white. If we want white in our painting, we have to save it. And masking fluid is a great way to do that because it's a temporary resist. I can save that white, but then I can come back even with the dry lift or the wet lift. I can come back and I can continue to work in that area. I can shade that white. I can paint over it if I decide I don't like the shape I had left. But there are also a few resists that are permanent. And I don't use them very often, but I wanted you to be aware of them because they give slightly different effects. And as far as I know, once you've done them, they stay there. The first one we're going to do this morning is a crayon. I've split this one into two just to put them both in the same place. So we're going to use wax from a candle and we're going to use crayon. And the next thing we're going to do is our wax paper. So just mark the front and the back with a pen. A pen seemed to work pretty well, or a marker. And we're just going to mark one side front, one side back. And then take your wax paper on the front side, lay it over your watercolor paper, and draw on it. Then I want you to turn the wax paper over on the other side of that wedge. Draw on that. So this was the back, and this was the front. Just to see if we notice a difference between the two sides of the wax paper. It'd be good to know if that's important, right? Oh.
So front and back, and
then I just laid it, after I labeled the two sides of my wax paper, I laid it down on the watercolor paper, and you can write your name, you could scribble. I would give an area of solid, heavy rubbing, and maybe an area that has more fine line rubbing. And then it's time to mix up some paint. So if you haven't sprayed your paints down yet, grab your spritzer bottle. I'm just mixing up some blue and a little bit of the red. Doesn't really matter what colors you use. Where you've got your crayon, go ahead and throw some water on there, and some color rather. Where you've got your wax candle, and then the same thing where you did your wax paper. Is everybody seeing the resist?
Yes.
Okay. When would you want permanent resist? How about if you were doing a winter scene and you had snow on the branches of the trees? I wouldn't want to put a permanent resist on trees that were very close to me because I like to come in and shade those a little bit. But if there are trees that are back in the far distance, or you want to suggest light branches against the sky, you know, the wax paper would be a nice way to do that. You can draw very detailed things. And then when you come in and put the wash of your sky in, you'll see those trees back superimposed against it. So those are permanent resist methods. But there's another kind of resist that I use that's very similar to the dry rub. And we're going to get that set up. And then I'm going to show you how to use salt. So what I'm going to do down here where it says spritz rub, I don't even know if this was on your list, but if you have a little piece of paper, you can add this to your grid at another time. And we want to get some nice dark color in here. So nice and rich. And we're just going to let that dry. I'm going to do the same thing in the wedge or square that's marked salt. I want you to put in a nice rich wash of color. It's going to be fairly dark. I'm going to show you how to use salt as a resist. The easiest way to do it is to take your salt and just put a little bit out on the table. You want to wait until your paper is absorbing most of the pigment. So right now mine is really wet and my colors are moving rapidly and there's still a lot of water on there. It's very, very shiny. But as the paper begins to dry, the pigment loses some of its shine. It starts to become a bit more matte, and that's the magic time. Now, obviously, my paints are going to dry more quickly here around the outside edges, and they'll dry less quickly here in the center. But as soon as I feel like it's starting to lose some of its shine, I'm going to press my finger down into my salt and sprinkle it onto the paper. Now, if the paper is too dry, the salt won't have any effect. And if it's still a big wet puddle, the salt is just going to dissolve and it's not going to have any effect either. But you can see in this corner how I'm starting to get little dark grains. That's the salt absorbing my pigment. And we're just going to leave that there and let it dry. The last thing we're going to do is go back to our masked area as far as on our technique sheets. I also like this Peebo drawing gum because it changes color as it dries. If it's a really dark gray, it may still be wet. And when it's dry, it turns to like a lighter blue. So now I'm going to take the colors that I've been working with this morning, and I'm just going to paint right over that masking fluid. Once you've painted over your masking fluid and put some salt down into your salt grid, we're just going to set that to the side. I want to give you a little demo about masking your cone flowers.